Welcome to DEF CON 3. I'm KT McFarland. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, people said, what does he know about foreign policy? He's just a governor. Well, it turned out that in the 8 years of Ronald Reagan's presidency, he was one of the shrewdest foreign policy presidents we've ever had. And then he negotiated deals with enemies, he turned friends into better friends, and ultimately set in place the policies that won the Cold War. Joining me now to discuss President Reagan and his presidency is Professor H.W. Brands. He's just written a new book called Reagan, the Life. So thank you so much for joining us. You know, what lessons did you learn about Reagan's foreign policy expertise and how much of a grasp he really had on American foreign policy?
The secret of Reagan's success in foreign policy was his ability to focus on the biggest issue at any given time. For Reagan, the principal issue of American foreign policy during the 1980s was the Cold War. And he had one single goal: defeat communism. He wasn't willing to compromise. He wasn't willing to allow communism to extend indefinitely. The goal was to defeat communism. He kept his eye on that ball. And, of course, he took the United States and the free world right up to the edge of the defeat of communism. By the end of his presidency, he was pretty much all over but for the shouting with the Soviet Union.
You know, Secretary Baker, who was Secretary of Treasury and Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, later Secretary of State, he said the thing about Reagan, unlike every other president he'd ever been around, was Reagan knew when to hold him and Reagan knew when to fold him. So talk to me about the negotiations. How would Reagan approach negotiations today? Reagan negotiated with the Soviet Union. We're trying to negotiate with Russia. Reagan negotiated in the Middle East. We're trying to historically and significantly negotiate with Iran. How would President Reagan have handled the negotiations with Iran?
Reagan prided himself on being the only president to have been a union boss. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and in that position, he learned his negotiating skills. Now, Reagan always had a bottom line, and he knew what it was. He didn't reveal it to the other side, but he knew how far he could go and beyond which he wouldn't be willing to go. Reagan also prided himself, and quite rightly, on his personal skills. He wanted to get in the room with his opposite number. And, in fact, that's what led to the breakthrough with the Soviet Union. Reagan got to know Mikhail Gorbachev. He had famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire, but that didn't prevent him from sitting down with Gorbachev on several occasions, getting to know him, understand what Gorbachev needed, and come to terms that between them they created the first serious arms negotiation cut of the Cold War, the INF Treaty of 1987, Intermediate Nuclear Forces. How would Reagan handle Iran? This is a difficult issue because the problem is that the principal on the Iranian side is not sitting down in the room. And there's no indication that the Supreme Leader of Iran would sit down with President Obama or anyone else, or if Ronald Reagan were president. Now, somehow Reagan would have to figure out how to get around that issue. But Reagan would know where the bottom line was. If he had decided that it was utterly unacceptable for Iran to develop nuclear weapons, then he would be prepared for that contingency. He would negotiate up to a certain point, and if the negotiation stalled, he would be willing to take the next step. And if that meant military action, that's what it would be.
What about Reagan walking away?
Reagan walking away from the negotiations?
Well, some people have said that what we ought to do in negotiating with Iran to make a tougher negotiation is we've got to be willing to walk away. If they're not meeting our terms, walk away. Would Reagan have done that?
Quite possibly. But he would want to know, what am I going to do the day after I walk away? And he would have thought this through. And so, for example, the best illustration of this is when he was dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev at Reykjavik. And the two came very close to a deal that might have eliminated nuclear weapons between the superpowers. But Reagan had made this promise to himself and some other people that he would not negotiate away SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And he wouldn't confine it to the laboratory the way Gorbachev wanted. And they came very close to a deal. But Reagan walked away from that deal because it didn't meet what he considered to be an absolutely essential aspect of his policy.
When you look today at what we're talking to Iran about, what sticks out to you as the sort of thing that maybe Reagan would have said, look, I'm going to go here, but I'm not going to go any further? We seem to, every time we negotiate, we seem to give up a little more and get a little less.
Well, this is the question. And so whoever would be in the position of negotiating with Iran would have to decide, first of all, is it absolutely essential that Iran not develop nuclear weapons? And there presumably should be some timetable with respect to this. And so we're going to get a deal by this particular date. And if we don't get a deal by this particular date, we take the next step. And it may be military action.
Well, Reagan is also reputed to have gotten along very well with his archenemy on Capitol Hill, the Democrat, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. How does that compare to today?
Reagan conspired in the idea that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he and Tip O'Neill, another Irishman, were just two old Irish buddies swapping stories and having a drink. In fact, Reagan could not stand Tip O'Neill. But he thought it was good for politics and good for policy to let that out. Tip O'Neill was one of those few people who utterly resisted the Reagan charm. And Reagan just shook his head over Tip O'Neill, that he couldn't believe that Tip O'Neill would put partisan considerations ahead of the national interest. And that's the way Reagan viewed O'Neill.
As somebody who was willing to put his own career in front of American national security.
Yeah, definitely. And Reagan couldn't forgive that in someone.
Well, thank you so much for that insight into my old boss, President Ronald Reagan. That's Professor H.W. Brands with a new book that I can't wait to read called Reagan, The Life. Thanks for joining DEF CON 3.